Welcome back, everyone. We're going to begin this segment of our series on the Civil War with this question that I want you to reflect on, not only based on what we've already talked about and seen, but what we have yet to discuss about the war. And the question is, how significant was the impact of the Civil War? And I want you to think beyond terms of military history, which inevitably we end up falling into that pattern. But I want you to think about how it impacted politics in this country, how it impacted civil liberties on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line, how it affected people's perspectives about war and sacrifice, heroism, how it affected civil liberties on a number of levels. It profoundly changed this country, even culturally, believe it or not. And so this is what I want you to keep in mind as we continue. If you remember, the last time we were speaking, General Lee had profoundly routed McClellan outside of Richmond, forcing McClellan to abandon his plans of taking the rebel capital and having to throw the entire Peninsula campaign in the garbage. President Lincoln is not happy, actually removes him as general in chief from the Union Army, although he stays in command marginally of the Army of the Potomac. No one is very happy. This is bad news for the Union, but very good news for the Confederacy and Robert E. Lee, who is going to see himself in command of the Army of Northern Virginia for the remainder of the war. And not wanting to, lose that momentum, though, President Lincoln's quite frustrated that McClellan failed, so he orders immediately, go ahead and let's do what we were supposed to do the right way a year ago. A full frontal attack towards Richmond. Um, Now that we've perhaps exhausted Lee in his defense of the city, perhaps that we could march what we have of the army southward and take the rebel capital and be done with it. And that's where we're going to get the second Battle of Bull Run, or Second Manassas. It occurs roughly a year and a couple of months after the first one, and the outcome is nearly the same. And that image that you're seeing there is from some special units in New York. Some units were allowed to, I guess, accessorize their uniforms. These were the Swabbies. By the way, what you've seen so far in illustrations and images about the Union uniform, it's basically a French uniform. Okay, the kepi hat is basically an army what you see in the French army, and of course the Confederate uniform is a variation of the Union uniform. Well, these New York regiments, the Swabbies, they were allowed to tweak their uniforms. They were allowed to wear red baggy pants and red hats. And of course, we're just starting to learn about camouflage and appreciating camouflage and walking away from some of the rules of Napoleonic warfare. Needless to say, um, by the time you get to the mid 19th century, wearing red on a battlefield turns out to be a bad idea, something that these Wobbies are going to learn at the Second Battle of Manassas. Long story short, on day one and day two, General John Pope marches um, the Union Army out of D.C., once again taking the road to Richmond, once again intercepted at Manassas Junction. In this particular instance, General Thomas Stonewall Jackson, now promoted to a division commander, I believe, lures Pope just outside of Manassas Junction and takes up defensive positions behind a stony ridge. Um, Pope is going to spend pretty much the second day launching a series of attacks trying to dislodge General Jackson from his defensive positions. What General Pope does not know is that General Jackson is expecting reinforcements, and they arrive on day three. General James Longstreet arrives with 25,000 reinforcements and assaults Pope's left flank. Overwhelmed, bewildered, caught by surprise, and now outmanned and outgunned, General Pope has to, like his predecessors, order a forced retreat back to Washington, D.C. At the end of this battle, the Union's going to lose over 14,000 men. That means either dead in combat or wounded or taken captive. When we say casualties, that's what we mean. Dead, wounded, or captive. To the Confederacy's roughly about 7,000. So chalk that up as another victory for the Confederates shortly after the massive victory they won outside Richmond at the conclusion of the Peninsula Campaign. General Lee reorganizes the Army of Northern Virginia and reassesses the entire situation of this war. In his evaluation, his adversaries, his rivals have given him very little to admire or to be worried about. General Lee, naturally being more aggressive than perhaps Johnston that came before him, believes that this is an opportunity that he could exploit. And walking away from the South's grand strategy of offensive-defensive, Lee is, for the first time in this war, going to go on the offensive. In other words, the Army of Northern Virginia is going to invade, is going to cross the line and invade the North. What exactly is General Lee looking to do? General Lee just can't walk into Washington, cross the Potomac and walk into Washington. Washington is one of the most heavily fortified and defended cities, if not in the hemisphere, in the world at this time. Meaning, if there is a weak spot by which someone could enter an enemy army could enter Washington, D.C., it's through the north. So, he's going to take 55,000 men, march them about 60 miles north to sweep in an eastern direction and then south and hit Washington from the north. The goal is pretty bold. He wants to take Washington, D.C. If he could march his army, if he could sneak past the defenses, sneak past the Union Army, march into Washington, D.C., and corner Lincoln, he might just force Lincoln to recognize Southern independence. Lee doesn't want to come in and take over and conquer the North. That's not his point. But if he delivers something humiliating to Washington, like its own capital being taken by the Confederates, that might force Lincoln to recognize Southern independence and end this war. So it's kind of a bold plan. He's like I said before, he's going to march north about 60 miles with 55,000 men. He's cutting a supply line, so they have to march on their stomachs. That means whatever they eat is whatever they find, whatever they wear, or whatever they arm themselves with. Whatever they don't, they're gonna have to find it along the way. And he's marching north. There is a deviation that Lee is gonna plan ahead. Okay, so this is part of Lee's plan. He's marching north to find the opportune spot that he could sweep around the Union Army, head east, and then back south again. But in this overall plan, there's also a plan to, I guess, pull a ruse to trick the Union Army to head in another direction. This is how he's going to fool them to go somewhere else so he could get around them. So as he's crossing into Western Virginia, heading into Maryland, that's why it's called the Maryland Campaign, he's going to send a third of his forces to attack Harper's Ferry under the command of Stonewall Jackson. Harper's Ferry is still important. It's one of the largest armories, in the country. Hopefully, if the Union hears that Harper's Ferry is being attacked by Jackson, alarm bells are going to ring all over the capital. They're going to send an immediate response, and this will give Lee the opportunity to sneak through and do what he wants to do, which is enter Washington, D.C. And it might have happened. It might have worked. This is one of the moments throughout the course of this war that the end result of the war just maybe might have ended differently. Okay, it was a well put together plan. On paper, it looked like it should have worked. As copies were drafted of this plan, Special Order 191, to distribute to various corps commanders, because that's the way chain of command goes. Okay, corps commanders get the orders first, then they instruct their division commanders, etc., etc. As they broke camp and headed north, somebody left a copy of their orders in a cigar box. Union scouts scavenging the Confederate, and spies scavenging the Confederate camp for anything that might help the war effort stumble upon this cigar box, stumble inside a copy of Special Order 191 inside a cigar box, and before you know it, that information is heading to Washington. Lee thinks he has a great plan that could end this war immediately, and what Lee doesn't know, that it's not going to take long before Washington knows exactly what he's up to. Lincoln is going to give McClellan one more chance to redeem himself, and he should not get this wrong. He knows what Lee's up to. He knows where Lee is actually heading. This should end the war for the Union. So Lee does what he does. He sends Jackson off to Harper's Ferry, but the Union only sends a small force to respond. McClellan keeps the majority of his forces together and intercepts Lee outside the town of Sharpsburg near Antietam Creek on September 17th, 1862. And this is the end of the line for any plans that Lee might have had to continue on to Washington. There, his 40,000 men, less than he left Virginia with, is met by a force twice its size, 90,000 men, under the command of General George McClellan. This battle is going to take place over the course of 12 hours. At first, they're going to attack Lee's left front, and then they're going to attack Lee's right front. The Confederates forcing Union soldiers to cross a very narrow bridge, about 12 feet across, and then towards the end of the day, attack Lee's center. Despite the overwhelming force that hit all of Lee's flanks, both left, right, and center, enough of Lee's men were able to hold the line and stand their ground. Before you know it, the day's over. Under cover of darkness, remember it's the 19th century, armies have to pull back for the simple reason you can't see in front of you. Okay, you post guards, you post skirmishers to make sure no funny business happens throughout the course of the night, and you plan out how you're going to re-engage the enemy as soon as the enemy is visible, pretty much the following morning. And actually, Lee takes that opportunity to reassess his situation, realizing that there is no way to Washington, given the situation that he's been forced into after taking incredible losses at Antietam. And actually, Lee retreats back south to Virginia. But he loses 25% of his army at Antietam. So Antietam technically is a Union victory. If you're looking at body count, Antietam is a Union victory. It's kind of a loss for everybody. 22,000 casualties on one single day. This is the bloodiest single day in Civil War history. 22,000 casualties on both sides, most of those casualties being Confederate. And so Lee retreats back south. And by the morning, the Confederates are gone. And McClellan, instead of pursuing Lee, has taken a lot of losses as well. McClellan retreats, well, not retreats, but falls back to Washington, D.C. Here's an image of that famous, the right flank attack that was supposed to cross that bridge. Eventually, a New York regiment did it. And compare that illustration to photographs that were taken by Alexander Gardner. And the Civil War is interesting because it's the first Civil War that photography is readily available to the masses. Soldiers save money in order to take a picture and have a picture sent back home. But photography also changes the way we understand war and death. You could have these heroic illustrations that are that approach war in a particular way, kind of skirt over the worst parts of war, or make them seem heroic, and then you have these photographs that people had to wrestle with, the gravity of, what actually happens to people in war, the mortality that these pictures speak to. And it change, it forces us to, deal with very uncomfortable things, and it changes public perceptions about war. Needless to say, when President Lincoln receives news that McClellan fell back to Washington and did not pursue a wounded Lee back to Virginia, knowing very well that once Lee gets back to Virginia, he could just recuperate his forces and continue to fight another day. At this point, Lincoln has had enough of McClellan. He feels he's given McClellan enough chances. And McClellan is 2 months after the Battle of Antietam, McClellan is relieved of duty um, from President Lincoln. So President Lincoln, he had something on the back burner. He was hoping for a Union victory before the end of 62. Uh, something political, something political that he hopes would hurt the Confederate war cause. And even though Antietam on paper was a Union victory, it could have been the end of the war. McClellan failed Lincoln. That's what he gets rid of McClellan. But Lincoln's still going to go ahead with what he's had, in the back burner for a while. He already bounced this off of his cabinet. And we have let's spend a minute or two talking about Lincoln's cabinet. Lincoln was a very interesting leader. If the North had an advantage in leadership and political leadership, it was Abraham Lincoln. So Abraham Lincoln was one of those rare presidents that, upon becoming president, he actually extended his hand to people that actually ran against him in the Republican convention. He extended his hand to both radical Republicans and more conservative Republicans and brought them into his administration. So he wanted to hear various tendencies within the Republican Party and have them in his presidency rather than push them away. And some of the most well-known, these people were rivals of Lincoln and end up being solid, almost fanatical followers and supporters of Lincoln by the end of his presidency. Edwin Stanton, his Secretary of War, abolitionist background. Salmon Chase, Secretary of Treasury, a guy's a genius in finance. He's the guy that came up with the greenback, but sketchy and a bit of a backstabber, and Lincoln's going to get rid of him in 65. Gideon Welles, Lincoln's Secretary of the Navy, who we called Neptune, in the same way that he called Stanton Mars, the god of war. William Seward, once a political rival to Lincoln, ends up being his number one defender, if you will, and has a history very tied to Lincoln at the end of all this. Edward Bates, Montgomery Blair, Postmaster General, all these people he ran, even Hannibal Hamlin, it's not on President Lincoln's, not on this picture, but that was President Lincoln's vice president. He was an abolitionist. So he runs this idea by all of them and gives them, an opportunity to weigh in and give them feedback before he goes ahead and does it. Taking advantage of, you could say, a Union win, not a complete win, but a Union win in Antietam, and taking advantage of that momentum and that bit of morale, he goes ahead and he issues the Emancipation Proclamation on September 22nd, 1862. It's issued as an executive order. It falls within the war powers of President Lincoln as commander-in-chief. So, this isn't a congressional act. He doesn't need it. He doesn't need a congressional act to do this. He's doing a couple of things. He is attempting to resolve the issue of low morale in the Union Army, especially after a series of defeats. He's also attempting to finally settle the legal issue of what do we do with slaves when they cross Union lines and have expectations that somehow they will be free, but the law is more complicated. We've talked about this before. And he's also hoping to undermine any possible European support that the Confederates are still holding on to. The Confederates, the British were looking at the Confederates. If Antietam would have turned out differently, if Antietam would have been a victory for the Confederates, that just might have convinced the British to come in. If they're going to back a horse, they're going to back a winning horse, a horse that has a chance of winning. And Antietam is the first sign that the British may back out. So, he's issuing on September 22nd, 1862, effective January 1st, 1863. A lot of people think the Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves. It did not. It is very specific. And like I said, it's addressing a number of things. What do we do with runaways? How do we settle that legal question? How do we inject morale, a sense of purpose, a true cause to this war? And probably the thing that stands out the most out of the proclamation is when Lincoln says he declares all slaves in those states or parts of states in rebellion to be thenceforth and forever free. Pay attention. He's not talking about the border states. He is basically saying that as far as he sees things, everybody, all the enslaved currently in the Confederacy, those states in rebellion, or parts of those Confederate states that have yet to be occupied by the Union, are henceforth they're free. They're not slaves anymore. That means that from that point forward, if they approach Union lines, the president has already given the go-ahead, okay, to his officers, to his commissioners, to treat these persons as emancipated persons. And it also gives the go-ahead up to now with the Confiscation Act. All they've done is basically labeled escaped slaves as enemy contraband. Maybe we might have to turn you back into your owners, maybe not. In the meantime, you're here, we'll call you contraband. This settles the question. We're not going to sell you back, we're not going to give you back to your owners. You are free to go. The border states are not affected by this. Their emancipation of the border states is going to come a little bit later. In fact, a couple of months before this, they already had a test run in Washington, D.C., where the federal government paid $300 to every slave owner in D.C. to emancipate their slaves. There was about 900 slave owners in D.C. alone. Other details of the Emancipation Proclamation, it also allowed for the enlistment of black soldiers, something that Lincoln had been avoiding up to now, hoping that, you don't want to incense the Confederacy. At this point, he doesn't care. He wants to incense the Confederate, to make them angry, and so he allows for the enlistment of black soldiers into the Union Army. Over 200,000 are going to join the Union Army's ranks during the war. He hopes to undermine European aid for the South, and it's successful because now he turns this war not about keeping the Union together. Now it's about slavery. It's about ending slavery. It's about freedom. It's about putting an end to the practice of owning human flesh. How does the South react? Badly. Number one, this kind of justifies their cause, right? See, I told you Lincoln was out to abolish slavery. Look, he just did it. Okay? They're going to react. The Confederate Congress, by May of 1863, is going to pass a law. Any black soldiers in Union uniform that are caught by the Confederacy will be treated as slave insurrectionists and almost guarantee get the death penalty. Any white officers leading black soldiers into war will be treated the same, and it escalates. There's a tit for tat because the Union responds with, any prisoner of war that you execute, we're going to execute a Confederate prisoner of war. So, these are some of the more details. This is how the South reacts to the Emancipation Proclamation. But we're getting closer. This is a step closer eventually to, spoiler alert, the 13th Amendment, which happens at the end of the war. December 11th to the 15th, 1862. And I think I've spoken to you guys about, listen, in the mid 19th century, the whole world, not just armies, but just the world was more at the mercy of things like weather and times of the year and seasons. Um, Winter was a problem. If once winter set in, roads could be impassable. Rivers and streams get frozen over, and whether they could be crossed or not becomes a very sketchy thing. Weather becomes bad. Food availability becomes scarce. Therefore, you don't see much happening at all during winter. Traditionally, armies would set up camp or winter quarters, wait out the winter until the spring arrived. Lincoln does not want to lose momentum. Okay. Antietam was just in September. We know that Lee ran back south, but he's still tending to his wounds. Winter's been a little late to start this year in 1862. The rivers haven't quite frozen over, and he doesn't want to surrender that chance. If we can make a move on Richmond now, with the Confederates wounded, why the hell not? Let's do this. And so out of Washington marches the Army of the Potomac once again, and they're heading south towards Richmond. This time, they're going to find themselves stopped, intercepted. This particular point. The river you see there, and you're looking from the Union's perspective, is the Rappahannock River. Across the Rappahannock River, the city of Fredericksburg. And beyond Fredericksburg, Richmond. As I said, the Army of the Potomac, over 100,000 men, in one long continuous column coming out of D.C., heading straight for Fredericksburg, stop at the Rappahannock River. It's winter. So a couple of things to say here, because there's a lot of misconceptions about what happens next. Well, I'm going to tell you the misconception and what really happened. Pretty much the idea, Burnside, General Ambrose Burnside, and we're going to see a picture of him. He's the new commander of the Army of the Potomac. He gets to this river, and the first obstacle there is crossing this river in order to enter Fredericksburg. Apparently, his aides told him, General, the sooner we get across this river, there's not a Confederate within 100 miles. If we take that town, we could use that town as, a fortified base of operations and to continue our march southward. But you have this problem with the river. Apparently, his aides told him, if we go upriver, the water is shallower, our men could start crossing over before any Confederates are anywhere in the vicinity, take and secure that city, and then the rest of the army could continue on forward. And apparently, they blame Burnside for saying, no, we're not going to do that until the entire army is here together. So here we are, General Ambrose Burnside, with sideburns. And there he is on the other side of the Rappahannock River facing Fredericksburg. The truth of it is he didn't cross the river early because he didn't want to. But the ability to, what he's going to need to cross that river are pontoon bridges. And even if he wanted to cross at that moment, he couldn't because the pontoon bridges were still in Washington. And he would have to wait until they arrived at the front And by then, a substantial amount of time was gonna transpire. If he would have taken the advice of his subordinates and gone upriver, yes, infantry could cross, but artillery cannot cross. Supply wagons cannot cross, and so you're going to end up with infantry on the other side of that river, and their supplies and their artillery on the other side of the river without an ability to cross over with them. So Burnside waits. But in the time that it takes for Burnside to wait for his pontoon bridges to arrive, Lee receives notice that it seems like the Union Army is going to cross at the Rappahannock across from Fredericksburg, and the Army of Northern Virginia heads north towards Fredericksburg, and it's the Army of Northern Virginia that takes the town of Fredericksburg and sets themselves up in defensive lines to protect the town and to protect Richmond to the south. By the time the pontoon bridges get there, they're building them under these conditions, under fire, if you will. It's going to take 2 days to build those bridges, as Army engineers are under fire by Confederate defenders in the front. Army artillery is trying to do what they can, shelling the city from on the other side of the river. Uh, so it's going to take 2 days to build and cross that bridge. When they finally do so, it descends into urban warfare. Rebels defending the city, the Union soldiers crossing those bridges, which are just basically rowboats held together with planks. They're fighting house to house, street to street, block to block, slowly pushing the rebel defenders out of the city. Um, and then something else happens. Lee calls for a retreat out of the city to fall back a good mile away from the city behind the wall. We're going to get to that wall in a second. And of course, having taken the city, the next step is the Union Army establishing themselves in Fredericksburg, begin a 1 mile charge towards the Army of Northern Virginia. And that's the picture of the Irish Brigade. I believe they were out of Massachusetts or New York, I'm not sure, but they made a name for themselves at the Battle of Fredericksburg. And as valiant and heroic as those Union soldiers were, once they get to this wall, it's over. This wall is about a mile behind the city. It's about, I'd say about 3.5, 4 feet tall, maybe 3.5 feet tall, and it goes. It goes on for like a mile or two. And on the other side of that wall were Confederate soldiers behind a very strong defensive position, protected by that stone wall. Long story short, no Union soldier ever crossed that wall. Okay? Men by the thousands were mowed down as they tried to repeatedly charge that wall. One Pennsylvania regiment tried a flanking maneuver around the right side of the wall's extreme, only to be decimated there by Jackson troops, an entire Pennsylvania regiment. Um, at the end of the day, at the end of several days of battle, so it's 4 days of battle. At the end of the fourth day, with 18,000, it's even at night, and the men are screaming at night for their mothers. They're in pain, they're dying, and they're just asked to lay low under cover of darkness. At the end of that fourth day, Burnside sends a message to Lee for a ceasefire so that they could pick up their dead, and Lee grants it. And the Union goes back across the Rappahannock River. Fredericksburg is another failure. And it doesn't matter that the Union had superior numbers either. 18,000 casualties on both sides. Most of those casualties are going to be on the Union side. And that's going to be the end of momentum for what's left of 62. We just have to wait. And so the Union actually sets up camp on the other side of the Rappahannock River. They're like within eyesight of each other. Maybe not within firing range, but they're within eyesight of each other. The Union sets up camp on the other side of that crossing and sets up their winter quarters there. In Lincoln fashion, once Lincoln hears of Burnside's disastrous defeat at um, at Fredericksburg, which of course he tried to blame his subordinates, and his subordinates blamed him. Lincoln just, okay, done. You're demoted. You're not in charge of the Army of the Potomac anymore. Who's next? And the next guy up to bat is General Joseph Hooker. Okay, okay, General Hooker. I hope you have better luck than Burnside and McClellan before you, because if you don't, you're also going to be removed from command, and I'll find somebody else. That's a lot of pressure. So Hooker, now in charge of the Army of the Potomac, has to come up with a plan that might work. And this is Hooker's idea. See, listen, my plan is to split my army in two. We're going to split the Union Army. We're going to wait for spring, of course. We can't do anything in the winter. Once spring starts to come around, I'm going to split my army in half. I'm going to march half of my army west towards the town of Charlottesville. And once we get to Charlottesville, we're going to launch a two-prong attack on Lee. And Lee's troops are quartered behind Fredericksburg during that winter. We're going to launch a two-prong offensive against Lee. We're going to, one more time, launch an offensive across the Rappahannock River to take Fredericksburg, while at the same time, half of the Union Army is going to march now east from Charlottesville and hit Lee from his left flank. Or at least that was General Hooker's plan. What Hooker did not expect was Lee could also be a pretty creative tactician, which he should have known by now. And so Lee responds to Hooker pretty much doing the same thing. Lee splits his army in half, keeps half of it for the defense of Fredericksburg, which he doesn't really consider very important. Like, he could lose Fredericksburg. And then he sends the other half under his most trusted commander. You notice he's mentioned time and time again, General Thomas Stonewall Jackson. He says, you know, the idea is, Jackson, I need you to go out there fast and find the furthest extent of Hooker's right flank. How far west are his lines extended? And can they be exploited? So Jackson takes off with 28,000 men. He avoids the main roads because the point is to remain undetected. 28,000 men, and he rides west for about 12 miles until he finally finds what he was looking for, the furthest extent of Hooker's right flank. At that time, when he arrives around 5:30 in the afternoon, the men are settling down in camp to have dinner. It doesn't seem like there's been any action that day. What they don't know is they are being encircled by Jackson's 28,000 men. And when Jackson gives the order at around 5:30 in the afternoon, his men come out of all 28,000 of them come out of the woods, encircle Hooker's right flank, and completely decimate it. In a very short period of time, Hooker's essentially lost somewhere between a third to half of his army. Okay, he thought he was going to be the sneaky, I'm going to outflank Lee, and what ends up happening, he gets outflanked by Lee himself. The rest of his army eventually gets the idea. There's a lot of commotion coming from the west. People are running towards the lines. Even animals are running in that direction. Disarray starts to set in. Hooker tries to reorganize his lines, and it's just going to be a lot of vicious fighting between Chancellorsville and and Fredericksburg. They attempt to cross the river and head into Fredericksburg as well. They're more successful in Fredericksburg, but it doesn't really matter. Hooker loses so many in this very failed campaign of his, um, that within a couple of days, he's issuing a retreat back across the Rappahannock. And so here you have another failure from another Union general and another Union loss. Um, should be noted um, that that's the very battle where General Lee loses Stonewall Jackson. Stonewall Jackson, on a reconnaissance patrol of his troops, it's dark. Um, a guard does what he's supposed to do, who goes there. Uh, Jackson doesn't want to say anything out loud for fear that he's not sure if it's a rebel guard or a Union guard, and that would be embarrassing to be taken prisoner. So he decides to stay silent, and the guard again, who goes there, and because there's no response, the guard shoots General Jackson in the arm. And you ever seen a mini ball? It's equivalent to a 50, between a 50-60 caliber projectile. It shatters the bone of his arm. He's taken to a field hospital, has to have his arm amputated. He survives the amputation, which not everybody did, but of course he's an officer, so he gets anesthesia, he gets the best possible treatment, he gets to be attended by the surgeons immediately, unlike most soldiers. It doesn't matter though. Within 8 days, he develops pneumonia, probably aspirated some liquid or food as he was resting, and he dies. And so, yeah, 4 days after being outflanked by Jackson, Hooker orders a retreat back across the Rappahannock River, and it is yet another loss. Not good. Fredericksburg is a loss for the Union. Chancellorsville is another loss for the Union. And Lee is thinking again, he's not very impressed by his rivals. He's thinking again, what if I go on the offensive one more and make sure that I don't leave anything behind? He hasn't put away the idea that if he could capture DC, he could bring this war to an end. And having defeated the Union once again at Chancellorsville, let's just say that Lee begins to entertain that idea once more. And we'll leave you at that until we talk again. Don't forget to like and subscribe.